The year is 1168, and although spring has arrived in Leicester, with cherry trees in blossom and daisies blooming, the medieval people of Leicester are in mourning. Just a few days previously, the powerful and respected second Earl of Leicester, Robert de Beaumont, died peacefully, aged about 64 years. Soon he would be buried here, close to the high altar of the mighty Leicester Abbey, the abbey he had founded some 25 years earlier. As Chief Justiciar to Henry II, Earl Robert was the second most powerful man in England, with the titles and wealth spanning both England and Normandy, commanding both the respect and admiration of the king and his peers. The fortune and prosperity of Robert de Beaumont's descendants looked secured for time immemorial. But just as it seemed that the embattled kingdom would finally be at peace with itself, there emerged two new threats to Henry II's reign and the fledgling Plantagenet dynasty. One from the ever-meddling Holy Roman Church and the other from the heart of his very own family. In the turmoil ahead, nobles and leaders would look for guidance from that stalwart noble family, the de Beaumonts of Leicester, who had gambled and had won at court so many times over the past 100 years. But could the new Earl play the game as well as his father and grandfather, or had Lady Luck finally come to collect her dues? I'm Jim Butler. Welcome to See No Royale, Part 5, Rebellion. During the early years of his reign, and despite spending much of that time in France, Henry II proved to be an effective and efficient ruler, restoring royal administration and finances in England, reclaiming lands ceded to the Scots during the anarchy, and re-establishing English dominance in Wales. Much of this success and stability for Henry in England can be attributed, at least in some part, to the efforts of his Chief Justiciar, Robert de Beaumont, the second Earl of Leicester. However, Henry's relationship with the church, especially in England, wasn't tranquil. Like most medieval European kings, Henry had a problem with the Holy Roman Church, namely that the church was actively trying to increase its own influence at the expense of royal power, adding to the increasingly common argument across Europe at the time. Who has the most authority? A king as God's chosen and anointed ruler of a kingdom, or the Pope as God's representative on earth? These were deep theological questions, but also ones with very real and often bloody consequences. So you can imagine Henry's delight in 1161 when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Bec, died, and the king saw an opportunity to replace him with one of his own loyal and trusted men. Henry's Lord Chancellor, one of the highest ranking officers in the medieval court, was a man named Thomas Becket, who, prior to taking up the office, had been Theobald of Bec's Archdeacon of Canterbury Cathedral. For the 7 years that Becket had been Chancellor, he had served Henry as a loyal statesman and diplomat, and even supported the king in his disagreements with the church. Even better, Thomas was Henry's trusted confidant and close friend. The king had even sent his eldest son to be raised in Becket's household. He was practically family. Who better then could the king wish for to become the new head of the church in England? Surely, with Becket as both Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry's plans to curtail the church's powers and privileges would meet no resistance at all. So, despite warnings and objections from his mother, his wife, and even Becket himself, Henry pushed forward with his plans, and Thomas's election to the post was soon confirmed by a council of bishops and noblemen, probably with the king looming very close by. Now, as Archdeacon, Thomas was only ever an administrator for the Diocese of Canterbury and had never even been ordained as a priest. But not even this was a problem for Henry. In what is probably the quickest career progression in history, Becket was ordained on the 2nd of June 1162 and then consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury on the 3rd. Job done. At least that's what Henry thought. What nobody, especially Henry, had considered in all of this scheming was that Thomas would actually take his new responsibilities as Archbishop seriously. But this is exactly what happened. Almost immediately, Becket resigned as Lord Chancellor, much to Henry's annoyance, and then began living a very pious and austere life, reforming himself from, as he said, a patron of play actors and follower of hounds, to being a shepherd of souls. From this point onwards, Becket became an almost constant thorn in the king's side. First, the grievances were on trivial matters in which no principal appeared to be involved. Then to more serious matters, like that of criminous clerks, where clerics in minor orders who had been found guilty of quite serious crimes, like rape and murder, had been able to escape with light sentences in the ecclesiastical courts. This infuriated Henry, and the resulting Council of Clarendon took away the power of the church to protect any convicted cleric. But Becket refused to authenticate the constitutions of the agreement and continued to support the trial of clergymen in the church courts. In October 1164, the quarrel between Henry and Thomas became more acrimonious, and the king ordered Thomas to face trial on several minor issues in an attempt to bring about the archbishop's downfall. As the king's spokesman, it fell to the Earl Robert de Beaumont to act as accuser and judge in the trial. After a few days of bitter argument, the time of judgment arrived. As the Earl uttered the words, "Hear then your sentence," Becket, standing barefoot in his vestments and carrying a great cross, roared at Robert that no nobleman, judge, bishop, or even the king could pass judgment on him. "I will be judged by our Lord the Pope alone, for he alone is competent to judge me." Becket then walked out before fleeing the court and travelling to Flanders. But even with Becket in exile, there still followed 6 years of almost constant bickering and battling between the two former friends, who both appeared to be as bloody-minded and stubborn as each other. However, at the start of 1170, none could have foreseen how events were to spiral so spectacularly and inexorably downwards within the next 12 months. Follow me. Now, before we get drawn into the dramatic events of the 1170s, it's worth spending a bit of time familiarising ourselves with the new Earl of Leicester. But first, a word on nicknames. After his death in 1168, the second Earl is repeatedly described as Robert le Bossu, which means Robert the Hunchback. However, there's no contemporary descriptions of him during his life as ever having a hunchback. So it's likely that this name was given to him after his death to help people differentiate him from the other Robert de Beaumonts that followed. Therefore, Le Bossu may have been so described because when he was remembered by the younger men at court after his death, they could have been referring to a stoop he had due to his old age, and they recalled that prominent physical detail. Similarly, his son Robert de Beaumont, the third Earl of Leicester, was given a nickname and became known as Robert Blanchemains, or Robert Whitehands in Norman. Although it is not clear as to why people refer to him in this way, regardless, the nicknames of the second and third Earl do make it easier to differentiate between the lives of the two men. The third Earl, Robert Blanchemains, was in his late 40s when he inherited his father's lands and titles. By the time he was married to Petronilla de Grandmesnil, the great-granddaughter and heiress of Hugh de Grandmesnil, the Norman feudal baron who William the Conqueror had gifted Leicester to, and whose son had been robbed of those lands by Robert de Beaumont, the first Earl of Leicester, finally uniting the two feudal families. The pair had at least 5 children together, and both were said to be devoutly pious, gifting lands and monies to churches and religious houses. To Leicester Abbey, Blanchemains granted a huge 750 acres of lands in Anstey, and Petronilla personally financed the great choir of the Abbey church. It was even said that a large chandelier in the choir was suspended from the ceiling by long plaits of Petronilla's hair. But although Blanchemains inherited his father's titles and estates, he did not inherit his coveted position at court. Instead, Henry II awarded the role of Chief Justiciar to Le Bossu's trusted deputy, Richard de Lucy. A lifelong civil servant, the 79-year-old de Lucy was sheriff of both Essex and Hertfordshire, and in time would become known as Richard the Loyal. For Earl Robert, without a major role at court, there was little else to do other than manage his estates. It's June 1170 and the nation is in a celebratory mood, for Henry II is about to succeed where the past 2 kings of England had so woefully failed. He's about to secure the succession of the English crown. And how is he doing this, you ask? Simple. He's having his own son, the 15-year-old Prince Henry, crowned joint king of England. Now to us, this may seem a little foolhardy, but actually there is some reasonable thinking behind it. First of all, as mentioned, this solves a succession problem that had caused chaos for generations and resulted in the bloody and drawn-out civil war that was the anarchy. Essentially, if there's already a crowned king when Henry II dies, then there's no chance for random siblings or nephews to lay claim. There's no need for nobles to worry about their estates, and so there is a smooth transition of power. Everyone's happy. In fact, the French have been doing this for decades already. Also, from Henry's perspective, he was about the age his son is now when his own father, Geoffrey of Anjou, gifted him the title of Duke of Normandy. And so, perhaps thinking how that responsibility had made him a better, more responsible young man, he must have thought it would have had the same effect on the young Henry too. Sadly, it did not. Perhaps the first inkling of the trouble to come was at the coronation feast that evening. In a symbolic act to show that the young prince's elevation to kingly status, Henry II himself served his son food, which the Archbishop of York cheerily remarked at, stating what a distinguished servant the young king had. But instead of enjoying the pleasant jest with the rest of the guests, Henry the young king, as he would now be known, retorted that actually it was entirely proper that his father should serve him, as he, at least, had been born the son of a king and a queen, whereas his father was only the son of a queen and a duke, and was therefore a lesser man. I imagine a somewhat awkward silence fell over the banquet, possibly with tumbleweed drifting down the aisles. The newly crowned Henry young king was already too big for his boots. This did not bode well. It wasn't, however, the young king who precipitated the first crisis of Henry II's reign, at least not directly. Instead, it was Becket who entered the fray, all proverbial arrows a-flying. It wasn't so much the crowning of Henry young king, whom he himself part raised, that upset Becket, but the fact that the coronation had been conducted in his absence by the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury. This despite the fact that the crowning of English kings is solely and entirely the privilege of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas, who was still in self-imposed exile in France at the time, was practically apoplectic with anger. In early December, Becket returned to Canterbury, and despite the fact the Pope had given his blessing to the coronation, he immediately has the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury excommunicated. News of Becket's actions soon reached the king, who had travelled to France for Christmas with his court. Furious that the excommunications potentially undermined the legitimacy of the coronation and therefore jeopardised his succession plans, Henry II is said to have uttered the words to the effect of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Although this is the most commonly quoted phrase attributed to Henry, the contemporary biographer Edward Grimm records the words, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such a shameful contempt by a low-born cleric." Either way, and whatever was exactly said, 4 knights in Henry's entourage, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy and Richard le Breton, took the king's words as a royal command and made haste for England. In all fairness to Henry, it is almost certain that he never intended his frustrated and angry words to be acted upon. But unbeknownst to him, on the evening of the 29th of December 1170, the 4 knights arrived at Canterbury Cathedral, where they found Becket at prayer in a side chapel. They demanded that he absolve the excommunication of the bishops who crowned Henry young king, but Becket refused. They then tried to physically drag the Archbishop from the cathedral with the help of a band of armed men, but still they could not manage it. So with frustration raised and tempers seething, swords were drawn. According to Edward Grimm, a monk who witnessed the attack and was himself injured in the following melee, the impious knights suddenly set upon the Archbishop and shaved off the summit of his crown. Then, with another blow received on the head, he remained firm. But with the third, the stricken martyr bent his knees and elbows, offering himself as a living sacrifice, saying in a low voice, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death." But the third night inflicted a grave wound on the fallen one. With this blow, his crown separated from his head so that the blood turned white from the brain. The fifth placed his foot on the neck of the holy priest and precious martyr and, it is horrible to say, scattered their brains with the blood across the floor, exclaiming to the rest, "We can leave this place, knights. He will not get up again." I can't emphasise enough how the murder of Thomas Becket sent shockwaves across Europe and beyond. In a similar way that the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center brought the watching world to a standstill, news of the cold-blooded murder of an Archbishop of Canterbury, whilst at prayer in his own cathedral, shocked and stunned the whole of Christendom. And the finger of blame was pointed solely and vehemently at one man, Henry II. If the fact that people thought the king had all but ordered the knights to commit the murder wasn't bad enough to condemn Henry, his failure to act in any way to arrest Becket's killers certainly was. Instead, he focused his attention on growing problems in Ireland and left the murderers to live unmolested for over a year at de Morville's castles at Knaresborough in North Yorkshire. The knights themselves eventually chose to travel to Rome to seek the Pope's forgiveness for the murder of Becket, and he ordered each of them to serve as knights in the Holy Land for the next 14 years as penance. With the outrage about Becket's murder still palpable across the whole country, with the English and Norman nobles becoming increasingly unhappy with him, and with Henry Youngking ever more frustrated at the lack of being granted any kingly power to go with his title, the embattled king was coming under increasing stress and strain. For the next couple of years, the royal court must have felt like a powder keg ready to explode. But of all the issues that could spark a crisis, the one that did finally light the epic fuse was the simple gift of a wedding present. So follow me. We've all been there. There's a special celebration coming up and you want to give the lucky person a gift, but they're the one person who already seems to have almost everything. This was probably what was going through Henry II's mind when trying to decide on an appropriate present for his youngest and favourite son, Prince John's wedding to the Countess Maurienne's daughter. His eventual decision was to bequeath John and his new bride 3 of his Norman castles, which seems a splendid and fit gift from a king. However, there was the small problem in that the 3 castles in question happened to be within the realm of Henry Youngking's inheritance. Young Henry was spitting feathers at what he saw as another blatant attempt by his father to undermine his ability to rule in his own right. Soon the young king was being encouraged by aristocrats on both sides of the Channel to rebel against Henry II. Finally, in March 1173, Henry the Young King withdrew to the court of his father-in-law, King Louis of France, who also happened to be Eleanor's ex-husband, where soon he was joined by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. His mother Eleanor attempted to join her sons, but was stopped by Henry and held in captivity. And so, after 5 years in the shadows, it was Robert Blanchemains' time to step forth and show his mettle. Like his father and his grandfather before him, it was time for the Earl of Leicester to enter the game and roll the dice in the latest round of royal roulette. But unlike his forebears, this Robert de Beaumont did not side with the reigning monarch. Instead, he threw his lot in with the young king and made straight for Normandy. It's not clear why Blanchemains sided with Henry the Young King at this time, whether it was a personal grievance against the king, frustration at his own lack of advancement at court, or whether it was because of the events around the murder of Becket. But whatever his reasoning, Earl Robert threw his whole force behind the decision and brought his wife along for the ride too. The rebels' strategy was simple but sound. The young king and his father-in-law built a wide alliance with Henry II's enemies, promised them land and revenues in England and Normandy in exchange for their support in deposing the king. Soon the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne invaded Normandy from the east. The young king and the King of France attacked from the south, and the Bretons attacked from the west. Meanwhile, William the Lion, the King of the Scots, invaded the north of England, and the rebel English earls would seize the Midlands, cutting the kingdom in two and dividing the loyal English-based forces. But if nothing else, Henry II was a brilliant tactician and a formidable warrior, and despite the odds, his troops managed to fend off all of the incursions into Normandy and northern England, taking some prized castles and heads along the way. Following an engagement against the Earl of Leicester, King Henry himself forced Blanchemains into an embarrassing retreat back to the Earl's castle at Royale, where the king besieged him. With Henry II now holding the upper hand, the disloyal Earl and the people of Leicester would soon experience the full wrath of the crown. With Blanchemains contained in Normandy, the king's chief justiciar, Richard de Lucy, whose position gave him royal authority to rule in Henry's absence, decided to besiege and obtain the surrender of Leicester. Soon, the now 84-year-old de Lucy arrived at the town's defensive walls, accompanied by the whole army of England, which included, but was not limited to, 410 archers and other infantry from the Sheriff of Shropshire, 10,000 crossbow bolts from the Sheriff of Gloucester, and, in a very neighbourly gesture, 156 carpenters and an engineer from the Sheriffs of Warwickshire and Nottinghamshire. Interestingly, this reliance on the royally appointed and loyal sheriffs to supply his forces rather than the nobility perhaps suggests that de Lucy wasn't entirely sure who he could trust. But why did the justiciar need so many carpenters, you ask? Well, with the people and defenders of Leicester safely behind the town's defensive walls, the principal weapon of any besieging medieval army was the trebuchet. A type of catapult, the counterweight trebuchet uses a rotating arm with a sling attached to the tip to launch a projectile at the enemy, and has been described as the most powerful weapon of the Middle Ages. The idea being that the huge boulders and rocks could be launched into enemy walls, smashing them to rubble, making the town or castle still susceptible to infantry attack. However, trebuchets were large, heavy and cumbersome pieces of equipment, not designed for travelling long distances, especially at any reasonable speed. And so rather than moving the siege engines from one place to the next, attacking armies would arrive at the town to be attacked, chop down the necessary numbers of trees, and then set the carpenters to work building the trebuchets. On the 3rd of July 1173, de Lucy arrives with the army of England and surrounds Leicester. Very quickly, work would have begun on building the siege engines, using the plentiful supplies of wood from Leicester Forest. Meanwhile, the huge granite rocks to be catapulted at the town were unlikely quarried from somewhere like Enderby, just to the southwest of the city. Despite what would have been a sustained bombardment from de Lucy's forces, the small garrison at Leicester managed to repel the attacks, and the town remains impregnable for over 3 weeks. This is most likely due to the leadership of the garrison's leader, their castellan Sir Anscatill Mallory, who is thought to be one of the Mallorys of Kirkby Mallory to the west of the city. However, towards the end of July, there appears to be a major fire in the town. The medieval chroniclers, Matthew Paris, Roger Howden and Ralph of Disaito, all describe the attackers causing a huge fire in the town, forcing the burgesses to surrender to the attackers on the 28th of July. According to Paris, a dreadful slaughter followed the capture of the town, leaving the cowed and demoralised citizens to buy their release for the princely sum of 300 marks. Having paid this price, the people were permitted to travel to one of the king's towns or castles, with some reports saying people travelled to St Albans and even as far away as Bury St Edmunds. In the heat of the fire, a massacre in the town that, depending on which source you read, happened either just before or just after the town surrendered, it was recorded that the northeast corner of the town, around the parish of St Michael's, suffered the most severely. It's said that St Michael's Church, which stood beneath what is now the John Lewis car park behind me, was destroyed in the attack, and the parish completely laid waste to the point where the district remained sparsely populated for centuries afterwards. A note of caution on the historical accounts though. The recent archaeological excavations in the area show that this part of the town was largely open ground, with dotted Roman ruins scattered around at the time of the rebellion. St Michael's has a construction date of the late 1100s, which was probably when the parish was founded, possibly due to a sudden population increase in this formerly uninhabited area of the town. Furthermore, although a great fire is mentioned in almost all of the historical accounts, the archaeological evidence remains non-existent. Such a fire destroying much of the town would be expected to leave a layer of black soot in the town's stratigraphy, the layers of soil that build up over time and that help archaeologists date structures, artifacts and events. However, such a layer has yet to be found in any of the excavations across the city that have dug to this date. Tantalisingly though, a couple of mass graves at the former St Clement's site at Blackfriars and St Martin's, which is now the cathedral, could be dated to the 11th to 12th century, and we await the scientific analysis to see if they can be tied to the 1173 siege in any way. Although the town surrendered to the attackers, Anscombe Mallory and the Leicester garrison did not submit. Instead, they retreated into the secure confines of the castle precinct and prepared to hold out longer. However, fortunately for them, the Scottish king, William the Lion, chose this moment to make his incursion into northern England, and so Richard de Lucy and his army abandoned the siege at Leicester and headed north to defend the king's territories there. This failure of the royalist forces to press home their advantage and conquer the Leicester garrison would prove costly, as Mallory and his forces would later seek to repay the damage caused to the town onto some of its neighbouring counties. With the people of Leicester left to literally pick up the pieces of their broken homes and their shattered lives, and the town garrison licking its wounds, the focus returns to Normandy, where Robert Blanchemains is about to unleash his anger on the king. Join me soon for the next instalment of Casino Royale.